Alright, today we're going to be making a little Japanese curry, and I'm going to show you how to do it without using the curry roux blocks that you normally buy at any Asian grocery store. Typically has them, which is the more like traditional way. Like in Japanese households, that's what they'll do, is they'll just use store-bought curry roux, but I'm going to show you how to do it without that. And we're also going to be making some croquette, which is like a Japanese croquette, and we're going to serve that up with our curry. So to get started, we're just going to start chopping up our potatoes and our vegetables for both the croquette and the curry. So for potatoes, just one quick tip about how to cut them. A lot of people will have problems if you just like slice right down. You can see sometimes you get a lot of like stickage. Of course, right now when I'm trying to show that off, it's not happening. But just a quick way to make sure that you don't get anything sticking to your knife is you can just do a drag cut instead. And just by pulling the knife through your vegetables like that, it's not going to stick at all. So I'm using 2 large russet potatoes here, which is probably a bit too much, but I thought 1 might not be enough. And obviously, to be shaping these, we're going to be freezing them. So you can just leave them in the freezer and eat them whenever you want. So that's a good thing to just make a bunch at a time. Get these potatoes in a pot. Alright, got our pot of potatoes. We're going to season it. And you want to start with cold water. That's just going to make sure that the potatoes come up to temperature all evenly. They're not going to cook, quicker on the outsides and get really mushy while the insides are still pretty firm. And it just gives the salt more time to soak in. We're going to get the onion for both what we're going to put inside the croquette and what we're going to use for big chunks in our curry later. We're just going to do like a really basic dice on this. So keep the root end on, bunch of vertical slices. This isn't really a tall onion, so I'm not going to bother cutting horizontally. And then just dice like that. And that's a good amount. Alright. And then for the onion we're going to put in the curry, we're just going to go with sort of a large shape. Whenever I'm making, pasta or curry or something like that, it doesn't really matter what size you cut your vegetables, but I like to have them all the same size. That way it just kind of is like a uniform eating experience. Alright, so we've got curry onions, croquette onions. We're going to cut the carrots for our curry first, and I'm just going to use Japanese technique. I don't really know what they call it in Japanese off the top of my head, but I've heard it called the random cut. So what you're going to do is slice on a bias and then roll the carrot. And just keep doing that. Keep rolling and cutting. And you end up with these really nice sort of like spearhead shapes. Just like that. So that's going to be for our curry. And then we've got a pan, just preheating on medium heat. Put some olive oil in there. And we're just going to saute our onions. You just kind of want to sweat them off a little bit so that when we mix them into the croquette later, you don't get like a, like a tough bit of raw onion. And for our carrot, I'm just going to grate it in there. And that's probably good. You don't have to use the whole carrot. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but I'm going to be making tuna croquettes. So I'm just going to use a can of tuna. Normally, I would just make vegetable croquettes, and I'd put curry powder in the potato mix with them. Just because I feel like that's good for eating over rice with, like a regular tonkatsu sauce or something. But because we're making curry already today, I don't want to like double dose on the curry. So we're just going to make tuna croquettes. Eat those with our curry. Add some salt here. Salting vegetables as they're cooking helps to draw out the moisture, which is going to make them cook faster, but it's not going to allow them to brown as easily because there's going to be more moisture in the pan. You could also put garlic in this if you want, but garlic's not really a very common ingredient in Japanese cooking, so I'm going to skip it. That's probably good. I'm just going to turn this off. And then we'll set it aside. And we can just wait for the potatoes to boil. So I've just drained them off. This is just the vegetables we had, and I added in the canned tuna there. Kind of flaked it all up. So we're just gonna go ahead and put that right in with the potatoes. And we'll just give them a good old smash and bash. We're like pretty far into the quarantine here, and things are kind of returning to normal. I still haven't bothered to get my hair cut, so I'm just taking to wearing sunglasses on my head to keep it out of my eyes. I'm just gonna throw a bit of milk in there. Kind of make it a little creamier, make the texture smoother. You could just use a bit of the water from the potatoes if you don't want to use milk. Or you could use a little bit of butter or something like that. And while the potatoes are boiling, I just got some rice going, which I don't really have any special tips for cooking rice, just use a rice cooker. If you want, you can throw some kombu in there to give it some extra umami. The big U. Alright, that's tasting really good. I wish I bought some celery while I was at the store, because that would go really well in here too, but hindsight is 2020. Alright, now we're gonna shape the croquette. So you're just gonna want a sheet pan with some parchment paper, and I'm gonna throw down some spray. This can's almost empty, but it should still work. Typically people will do like flour, egg, and then panko, but I do it a little bit differently. I actually make like a batter and then dip that in the panko, and I think that that just gives it like a better, thicker crust. For shaping them, you can use a little water if you want. That's just gonna keep them from getting too gummy and sticking to your hands. We're just gonna get our hands wet, grab a decent little amount here, and then I'm just kind of rolling them almost into like a ball shape, pressing them down like that. And the shape doesn't really matter. You could even just press it all onto one big tray like this and then cut it into squares after it's frozen, but I like the round shape like this. Just gonna throw them in the freezer now. So now we're gonna get our batter together for deep frying the croquette. Well, we're actually not gonna be deep frying them, but same difference. So we're just gonna start with an egg, some milk. We'll also throw in a little bit of water. And I'm not using exact measurement amounts, just because we're kind of looking for a consistency that you'll see once we get there. A little bit of salt, touch of sesame oil just for flavor. When I worked at the izakaya, we also used to put oyster sauce in here, but I don't think that's really a good idea, because if you're adding something that's sugary like that into this, it can really easily burn when we're frying it. But if you just add a little bit, it just helps to boost up the umami or whatever. I don't have any oyster sauce on hand right now, otherwise I'd probably add a little bit, but we're just gonna beat together our wet ingredients, and then we're gonna add our flour. So I'm just gonna go a spoonful at a time till I reach the consistency I want. Probably would have been smart to start with your dry ingredients and add the wet to it, but as long as you whisk it pretty vigorously, doesn't make a big difference. Basically what you want it to be like is sort of like a pancake batter consistency. Got some flour everywhere, that's cool. Yeah, that's looking good. Batter, panko, croquette, which have been in the freezer for probably about 2 hours. They're nice and firm now, so they're not gonna fall apart during the breading. All you wanna do is make sure you use one hand for the wet, dip it in the batter, and then one hand for the dry. You might want to use a bit bigger bowl than I chose here. That batter that we made, when I worked in the izakaya, we used to call it doro, which I think is just a Japanese word for mud. We would say back at the izakaya they've been completely doro pankoed now, so we're just going to throw them back in the freezer, and that's just going to help the coating firm up a little bit. And after you throw them in the freezer and they firm up a bit more, you can just throw them all into a plastic bag, and then they'll keep for maybe like 3 months in the freezer. Probably longer than that. I've definitely eaten ones I've had in the freezer for longer than that, but I don't want to be giving you any bad advice. So now we're going to get started on the curry part. So I'm just going to put some oil in a pan. We're going to start just cooking our vegetables a little bit. Now this isn't traditional at all. Normally what they would do is boil all of the vegetables separately. There's sort of this ideology with Japanese curry and I guess cuisine in general, that you really want to bring out the most flavor from each ingredient as possible. In the finished dish, you would actually pick a carrot and it tastes like carrot, and the onion still tastes like onion, rather than everything just having one big cohesive flavor. But in the interest of saving time and one less pot to wash, I'm just going to do everything in one pot for now. So we'll saute them for probably about 10 minutes or so until they're soft, and then we're going to make a roux right in here with all the vegetables, and star of our show is cheap generic curry powder. And then we're going to throw in some other stuff. Alright, so it's been like 5 or 10 minutes. Vegetables have softened up a little bit. Got quite a bit of color on them, which again, super non-traditional, but it's probably going to taste delicious, so I don't really care. Now we're going to make the roux. So roux is always fat plus some kind of, typically flour. Doesn't really matter what kind of fat you use for this. Butter is like the traditional French fat that you would use if you were making like a bechamel or something. If you're making like a gumbo or a jambalaya, like in Creole cuisine, they just use like regular, vegetable oil or whatever, something really high smoking point, and they just cook the hell out of it. I'm just going to use some margarine because that's what I have here. A good size little dollop, a large tablespoon, let's call it. We're going to get that all melted. Now at this point I'm also going to go in with my curry powder, and probably about a tablespoon or so of that. Maybe 2 tablespoons. Just like that. And last but not least, our flour. The way that I always remember is 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of flour will thicken up, I don't know, probably about 2 cups of liquid. It really depends on how thick you want it. That was actually maybe a bit too much flour, but we're going to roll with it. And then we're going to let it cook out for a couple seconds here. That's going to get rid of the powdery, dry flavor that flour can have. Alright, so now we're going to go in with our liquid. And you might be wondering what makes this Japanese curry, because all we did is put in some regular curry powder. But basically we're going to be using soy sauce and brown sugar, sort of as like a seasoning, and adjust the flavors using those. So if you have like some good chicken stock or something on hand, you can use that. You can also use like bonito stock, which I might do, but I'm going to use chicken stock today. So we're putting in some water. I'm just using this Better Than Bouillon, tried and true, everybody loves it. And then we're going to put in probably about a tablespoon of brown sugar to give it that signature sweetness. And a couple good glugs of soy sauce, probably about 2 tablespoons again there. That's just the magic number today, 2 tablespoons. As it comes up to temperature, it's going to thicken up. In the meantime, we can get started on frying our croquette. So I'm just going to put this off to a back burner, and we can start frying. Now, typically these would be deep fried, but deep frying at home is messy and has a lot of leftover oil, and then you gotta wait for it all to cool down and stuff. So the way that I like to do it is just to shallow fry it in a little non-stick pan like this. You want about 1/2 inch in there. Our oil is just about ready for frying. If you don't have a thermometer, or even if you do have a thermometer, like I've got one in the drawer right there, but the way that I like to test the oil anyways is just using a pair of chopsticks. As soon as you put them in, you should see a nice steady stream of bubbles will start coming from the tip of the chopsticks. And that means that your oil is ready to fry. So, you can put them in with a pair of tongs or something if you're nervous about it. I'm just going to carefully lay it in like that. That's why it's important that you want the stream of bubbles from your chopsticks to be really gentle and not too aggressive. So we've got that in there. And again, these I just made so they're not completely frozen. What I would do if I was cooking them from frozen is just put it on a little plate and throw it in the microwave for maybe a minute, and that'll just soften it up and sort of dry up the exterior so that you're not just throwing something completely frozen into oil, which can be very dangerous. So we're just going to let this go for a couple minutes on each side. And then you can just use your chopstick again to poke through and test. Just feel the chopstick to see if it's cold on the inside still. Everything's already cooked in there. So yeah, once it's warm and nice golden color on the outside, pretty much good to go. I'm also using quite a bit of oil here. I said you want about 1/2 inch, but really it works with like just enough oil that the croquette won't soak it all up. So normally I use a bit less oil than this because really if you're just cooking, you know, a quick weeknight dinner or something like that, you don't want to break out too much oil and make a big mess. You don't really need it, so why bother? That side's probably done. So I'm just gonna nice flip here. Beauty. Also, for what it's worth, it's like, it is really hot here, and I'm not wearing a shirt. Which is not a smart thing to do if you're frying stuff in oil like this, so here's a pro tip for you, don't do that. It's alright, because I'm a professional, I know what I'm doing. Alright, looking pretty good on both sides. We're just going to test them inside now. It's a little cold, but not too bad. Alright, I'm just going to call it there. That's probably good enough. Lift that out. Cutting board, let it cool. The oil off to the side to cool down. And yeah, now we'll plate up. And there we have it. Nice little Japanese style croquette curry. You know, you take like a weekend day or something, you make a bunch of croquette, you throw them in the freezer, put them in a plastic bag, and then it's a fairly quick weeknight dinner if you just want to whip up the curry and fry up one of those croquette. So there you go.